Mike's very insightful question is always, how do they know when to stop doing whatever it is they're doing? So how do the cells of a limb bud know when to stop growing fingers, for example, so that the fingers come out to the right size? Um, and that's a question that's really not answered.
You've co-produced a bunch of papers together that are super interesting. How does this fit into biology at different levels of self-organization? What are the implications for this?
Well, um, there are several ways to approach that question. I guess I'll do it from my own point of view. You could Mike ask Mike the same question. You probably get a different answer. Um, Certainly, one way that I think they're relevant is that when we think of what cells are doing, even when you think of what macromolecules are doing and molecular networks are doing, um, we can think of it in various ways. I mean, we can think of um, molecules in kind of the old-fashioned molecular model sense as these kinds of semi-rigid structures that are floating around in water and bumping into each other. Or we can think of them as physical systems that are exchanging information. And thinking about them in different ways influences the kinds of experiments that occur to you to do. So, a lot of the methodological changes that Mike has been one of the great leaders of in the biological community is a change from thinking of biological systems in, if you will, classical mechanistic terms to thinking of them in more agentive terms, i.e., thinking of them more from the perspectives of computer science and information theory, of thinking of cells, molecular networks, tissues, organisms as information processors that are communicating with their environments in various ways and trying to get their environments to do something. So, in the context of something like morphogenesis, where one is interested in how a group of cells are building a body, right? Uh, uh, Mike's very insightful question is always, how do they know when to stop doing whatever it is they're doing? So, how do the cells of a limb bud know when to stop growing fingers, for example, so that the fingers come out to the right size? Um, and that's a question that's really not answered. So, um, when you have questions that you can't answer, um, one strategy is always to say, well, let's try asking the question in a different way and see if that helps us come up with a way of trying to answer it. And that's what this agentive thinking is doing. Another way that I see this kind of uh, physics becoming important, which connects to the first way, really, is it asks us to um, understand these biological systems, other organisms or cells, in terms of what they're able to detect about their environments and how they model their environments internally. So, um, back in the 70s, I think, philosopher Thomas Nagel published a famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And it was really a paper about the theory of consciousness. And he was raising the question of think of how difficult it is to even try to imagine the experience of some other kind of entity. But in a sense, in biology, that's what we're constantly trying to do, right? We're constantly trying to understand how bacteria see their world, or how immune system cells see their world, or how cancer cells see their world, and how they represent what they are able to do in the world, uh, how they're able to predict what the world will do back to them if they do something to the world. So, um, and again, these are things that we view as completely natural and effortless, and so we take them for granted without thinking about them very much. So, if I stand up and turn around and walk out my door, uh, I am implementing a very large number of assumptions about what's going to happen at each stage of that process. And uh, I would be extremely surprised if I walked out of my door and instead of my hallway, there was an abyss that I fell into. Um, and we don't think about those things, we just get up and walk out the door. But somewhere those kinds of predictions are being executed and taken into account. And I think we'd be better able to manipulate, control, persuade, whichever language you want to use, um, biological systems to behave in different ways if we could understand how they were seeing their worlds and how they were modeling their worlds as environments that they operated in.
Just such a deep, fascinating question. I love how you've covered that. I think from my idea of how Levin would describe it, it's quite similar. I think it's the most beautiful idea in biology at the moment. This biology is cognition the whole way down. It's become a fascination of mine, and why I'm trying to speak to as many as Mike's friends as possible and get all their different perspectives, because I just think it's so incredibly fascinating, so cool. How do you think we would ever figure out how a cell is modeling its environment and modeling its actions of the world? Is that where information theory comes in again? That the only way to do that might be through an informational lens? And if so, do you have any sense what that might look like?
Well, um, I'll tell you a specific question that I'm very interested in with respect to cells. Do individual cells have any experience of 3D space? And if so, um, how do they manage to do that?
Thousands, 3D space.
And in fact, we can ask that question at any level of phylogeny, right? We know that we have an experience of 3D space, and if we watch other mammals uh, getting around in the world, it's pretty clear they have an understanding of 3D space. It's pretty obvious that birds have an understanding of 3D space. Um, But and if you look at, a school of fish responding to the approach of a predator, it's pretty clear that they have an understanding of 3D space. Um, but once you get outside of fairly familiar organisms, it becomes a lot harder to answer that question. So, um, do trees have a good understanding of 3D space? Do sponges have a good understanding of 3D space? Uh, and then do things like paramecia have a good understanding of 3D space? I mean, they're hunters in a three-dimensional environment. Um, they may be restricted in practice to surfaces, so they may have more of a sense of a two-dimensional space. Um, but when you look at a film of something like Lacrimario, which you may have seen, this is a lovely single-celled organism that has what looks like a long elephant's trunk sticking out of it, and that's where its mouth is. And oh, there are films available on the internet of this thing hunting, and it's sort of moving its body around slowly, but its head is kind of darting this way and that to collect edible things in its environment. I think mainly it's bacteria. So does that thing have a representation of 3D space that allows it to represent a target as being over there and then actually extend its neck and its head toward that target and consume it? Um, or is it all being done locally? Right. Uh, Rodney Brooks, the roboticist, wrote a paper back in the 90s, I think, in which he advocated for very distributed control of robots and not having central processors and making each leg, for example, know how to be a leg, but that was it, so that the legs could control their own motion of a walking robot. So maybe it works like that. Maybe maybe the head has no real representation of a 3D space, but just a represent. Sorry. Maybe the head just has a representation of local chemical gradients or something like that. So we don't know. Uh, but it would be interesting to try to design experiments to find out. Uh,
Right.
in the case of single-celled organisms, in the case of things like uh, immune system cells, which are roaming around in our bodies, attacking things for the most part. In the case of neurons that are doing migration early in the embryogenesis, they're trying to find targets guided by various kinds of local cues. Do those systems have any representation of 3D space that's analogous at all to the kind of representation that we have? And um, I think quantum information theory helps us there because it tells us in a fairly specific way of what's required to build a reference frame for something like 3D space. You need some objects that you can tell apart. Um, and so how do you tell objects apart if you don't tell them apart by location, right? You're going to use these objects the differences between these objects to define what location is. So you can't use their location to tell them apart. So you got to use something else. So um, maybe the objects are all clocks, for example, and they all run at different frequencies. So you can tell them apart by frequency. And since you can tell them apart by frequency, you can use them to define directions in space. You could say, well, something that's next to this one's in a different place than something that's next to that one. Um, so we have some guidelines for what a system has to be capable of doing, what it has to be capable of recognizing in its environment to build this representation of space.
I'm curious why, for you, the interesting question of all the questions you could ask of a cell in 2026, why 3D space representation is the interesting one. Because, there's many others you could ask. Does it experience positive or negative valence? How does it store memory? How does it learn? How does it represent its goals structure? How does it represent its goals as a single cell and then sort of unify it into cell tissues? I think representations of goals in these systems is incredibly interesting to think about as well. So I'm curious why 3D space representation is the most interesting one for you. Maybe that's at a lower level than goals, and goals is an abstracted representation of space.
Um, well, um, when you think about valence, for example, I think we have a pretty clear idea across pretty broad swath of phylogeny of how systems respond to stress and what sorts of things are stressful. And so stress is a pretty good stand-in for valence. And it's pretty clearly multidimensional, right? Stress is a vector. It's not just a number. Uh, Even bacteria can distinguish osmotic stress from temperature stress, for example, even though they may respond to the two in fairly similar ways. So I think we have a reasonable handle on that. Um, Representing goals, I think, is much harder. But to answer your question directly, um, part of the reason I'm so interested in space derives from physics. Oh, it's a question in physics. Where does space come from? Right? Is space fundamental, or is it um, a derivative of something else?
Right.
And there's a lot of work in the quantum gravity community on trying to derive space from something else. And typically, the something else is communication of some kind. So um, that suggests that space and communication are quite strongly coupled concepts. So I would like to understand how even what we might call fairly rudimentary systems, or much less complex systems than we are, represent and deal with space. In part because I think might help us understand what space actually is.
Right.
And whether it's a fundamental component of our environments, fundamental characteristic of our environments, or whether it's something that we um, construct and impose on our environments. Oh. And here, I think the language that Don Hoffman has used now for years, saying that space is a data structure that we use to organize experience. I think that's a very interesting idea. And um, it provides one way of thinking about some of the approaches in quantum gravity research, that space turns out to be effectively a data structure, a way of organizing communication, organizing data that's received from somewhere. So um, these different ideas, although they come from very different starting points and are expressed in different language, I think have fairly close relations. It'd be nice to understand what those relations are.
Right. I think
So that's why I'm interested in whether bacteria represent space.
yeah, it's so funny to think that, if we could understand how some simple system like bacteria can represent space, that it might actually provide something enlightening for on a human level or even a fundamental physics level that I didn't even remotely think of that angle. So it's fun to think where your brain is at and the kind of problems and the sizes, the scales that you're thinking at. The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel